In the darkest corners of the Andromeda Galaxy, where civilizations rise and fall like morning mist, there exists a legend that makes even the most hardened warrior's blood run cold. It speaks of a species so feared that their very name was erased from official records, their homeworld reduced to cosmic dust, and their survivors scattered across slave markets like broken toys. The Galactic Councils called it the Purge of Terra. They said it was necessary. They said humans were too dangerous to exist freely. But legends, like the humans themselves, have a way of refusing to die. Now, in the fighting pits of Zirian Prime, something stirs in the shadows. The slave masters speak in hushed whispers of a human who fights not just to survive, but with a calculated fury that defies explanation. They don't know his real name. They don't know his history. They only know that when blood is spilled and hope seems lost, prisoners begin to whisper a single word that sends chills through their captors: Reaper. What they don't realize is that legends aren't born from nothing. And some chains, no matter how strong, were never meant to hold the fury of a species that conquered death itself. The hunt is about to begin, and this time, humanity won't be the prey. The transport ship Valdris groaned through the void like a dying beast, its hull scarred by countless journeys between the slave markets of the Outer Rim. In its belly, pressed against cold metal walls, hundreds of beings from dozens of worlds huddled in the darkness. The air reeked of fear, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of blood that never quite left the ventilation systems. Marcus Chun pressed his back against the wall and counted his breaths. In through the nose, hold for 4 seconds, out through the mouth. It was an old meditation technique his father had taught him during their hunting trips in the Montana wilderness, back when Earth still existed as more than scattered debris floating in what the galaxy now called the Terran Graveyard. That felt like a lifetime ago, because it was. Around him, the other prisoners whispered in languages he'd learned to understand over the past 3 years of captivity. The Zelthani spoke of their crystal gardens, now reduced to industrial mining operations. The Korthax mourned their great libraries, burned by the hegemony forces during the subjugation campaigns. But none spoke as quietly as those few humans who remained, scattered among the other species like ghosts of a civilization that officially never existed. The galactic hegemony had been thorough in their work. When they decided that humanity posed too great a threat to galactic stability, they hadn't simply conquered Earth. They had atomized it, scattered its population, and systematically erased every trace of human achievement from the official records. According to the history books taught in hegemony schools, the Sol system had always been empty. Humanity was a myth, a cautionary tale told to keep rebellious species in line. But Marcus remembered the truth. He remembered the blue skies of his homeworld, the smell of rain on summer afternoons, his sisters' laugh as they raced through wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. He remembered the day the hegemony fleets appeared in Earth's sky, blotting out the sun with their massive dreadnoughts. He remembered the evacuation sirens, the desperate scramble for the transport ships, and the terrible silence that followed when the planet killer weapons fired. He had been 14 years old when he watched his world die. Now, at 27, he was property of the hegemony, officially classified as an unidentified bipedal species and valued at roughly the same market price as a Centaurian pack animal. The transport shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, and Marcus felt the familiar lurch in his stomach that meant they were approaching their destination. Through the small porthole across from him, he could see the sprawling industrial complex of Zirian Prime, the hegemony's largest slave processing facility. Massive orbital platforms surrounded the planet like metallic moons, each one capable of holding millions of prisoners. Fresh meat coming in, muttered Cax, a scarred Veltar whose ridged skull bore the ritual markings of a former warrior caste. He'd been a gladiator in the fighting pits for nearly a decade, one of the few who'd managed to survive long enough to become a veteran. "Hope you're ready for hell, soft skin." Marcus said nothing. He'd learned early in his captivity that silence was often the best protection. Let them think he was just another broken prisoner, another weak creature to be used up and discarded. It was safer that way. The ship's comm system crackled to life, and the voice of Captain Ilex, a particularly cruel hegemony officer known for his creative punishments, echoed through the cargo hold. "Attention, property. We have arrived at Zirian Prime. You will be processed according to your designated categories. Resist, and you will be recycled into organic paste for the nutrient processors. Comply, and you may live long enough to serve a useful purpose." The other prisoners shifted nervously. Marcus closed his eyes and thought about the knife hidden in his boot, a crude thing he'd fashioned from a piece of scrap metal during the journey. It wouldn't be much use against the guard's energy weapons, but it was something, a reminder that he was still human, still capable of choice, even here in the depths of space where hope came to die. The docking clamps engaged with a thunderous clang that reverberated through the ship's frame. Heavy footsteps echoed from the corridors beyond as hegemony guards took their positions. Marcus had seen this process before, during transfers between facilities. They would come in with shock prods and neural disruptors, sorting the prisoners like livestock at an auction. The cargo bay doors hissed open, and harsh artificial light flooded in, temporarily blinding the prisoners who had grown accustomed to the dim emergency lighting. The guards entered in formation, their black armor polished to a mirror shine, their helmets reflecting the terrified faces of those they had come to collect. Form lines by species, barked Sergeant Vorthak, a massive Thraxian whose 4 arms made him particularly effective at crowd control. Comply immediately or face immediate termination. The prisoners scrambled to obey, separating themselves into rough groups based on their physical characteristics. Marcus found himself in the smallest group, along with a handful of other humans who had survived the journey. There were only 12 of them now, down from the 18 who had boarded the transport. The others had succumbed to disease, despair, or the casual violence of their captors. Among them was Sarah Chun, no relation despite the shared surname. She was a doctor from the Mars colonies, her healing hands now marked by the scars of forced labor. There was Jean, barely 16, who had been captured during the evacuation of Titan Station. Old Henrik from Europa, who claimed to remember the time before the hegemony, when humans had been free to walk among the stars. And others, each carrying their own burden of loss and memory. The guards began their selection process, scanning each prisoner with handheld devices that analyzed everything from bone density to neural activity. Most would be sent to labor camps or industrial facilities. The lucky ones might find themselves assigned to domestic service. The unlucky ones would be sent to the fighting pits, where survival was measured in days rather than years. When the scanner passed over Marcus, it beeped with an unusual tone. The guard, a young hegemony trooper with nervous eyes, frowned at the readout. This one shows elevated muscle density and reflexive response patterns. Combat potential rating is unusually high. Sergeant Vorthak rumbled over to examine the readings. His massive frame cast a shadow over Marcus, who kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Interesting. The soft skins don't usually register as combat capable. Must be a malfunction. The readings are consistent across multiple scans, sir. Bone density, reaction time, strategic thinking patterns. This specimen shows characteristics typically associated with elite warrior castes. The sergeant's multiple eyes focused on Marcus with new interest. "Look at me, slave." Marcus slowly raised his head, meeting the alien's gaze without flinching. In those compound eyes, he saw the same look he'd observed in dozens of worlds from dozens of species. The look of a predator evaluating potential prey. The look of someone who had never met a human who wasn't already broken. "You have training," Vorthak observed. It wasn't a question. "I was a soldier," Marcus replied simply. It was true, though he didn't mention that he'd been part of Earth's Special Operations Command, one of the elite units trained to fight impossible odds. He'd been home on leave when the invasion began, had spent his last free days helping with the evacuation efforts instead of fighting on the front lines where he belonged. Which army? Which world? Marcus hesitated. To admit he was human was to invite either immediate execution or something worse. The hegemony had standing orders regarding any surviving humans who were identified as former military. They were to be transferred to special research facilities where hegemony scientists studied human combat capabilities and psychological resilience through methods that made the fighting pits look merciful. "My world is gone," he said finally. "Does it matter?" Vorthak studied him for a long moment, then made a notation on his datapad. "This one goes to the pits. Arena class. Let's see how long he lasts against the current champions." The decision sealed Marcus's fate, but he felt no fear. If anything, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years of captivity: anticipation. The fighting pits meant combat, and combat meant opportunity. In the chaos of the arena, things could happen. Plans could be made. Weaknesses could be exploited. As the guards processed the rest of the prisoners, Marcus caught Sarah's eye. She gave him the slightest nod, understanding passing between them without words. She would watch for her chance, as would the others. Humans were good at waiting. They'd had plenty of practice. The processing facility was a maze of corridors and holding cells, each one designed to break the spirit of those who passed through it. Marcus was separated from the other humans and led through a series of decontamination chambers, medical examinations, and psychological evaluations. The hegemony was thorough in cataloging their property. His new cell was a cramped metal box barely large enough for him to lie down, with a waste disposal unit and a feeding slot in the door. The walls were covered with scratches and markings left by previous occupants, some recognizable as countdown marks, others forming crude drawings or messages in languages he couldn't read. But there, in the corner where the light didn't quite reach, Marcus found something that made his heart race. Scratched into the metal, with what must have been fingernails worn to the bone, were words in English. "Remember Terra. Remember home. The Reaper comes." He stared at the message for a long time, running his fingers over the worn letters. Someone else had been here. Another human had passed through this place and left a message of defiance. The name Reaper was one he'd heard whispered in the transport ship and in the previous facilities where he'd been held. The guards seemed to fear it, though none would say why. As the artificial night cycle began and the lights dimmed to their minimum setting, Marcus lay on the cold floor and planned. In 3 days, he would fight his first match in the arena. He would face whatever champion they put before him, and he would win. Not just to survive, but to begin something larger. The hegemony thought they had destroyed humanity. They thought they had reduced the survivors to broken slaves, scattered across the galaxy like seeds on barren ground. But they had forgotten something crucial about humans. They were the species that had crawled out of caves to build starships. They were the ones who had looked at an infinite universe and decided to claim it. They were survivors. And survivors, given enough time and opportunity, became something more dangerous than any hegemony council could imagine. They became legends. Marcus closed his eyes and began to count his breaths again. In 3 days, the galaxy would be reminded that humans were never meant to be kept in chains. In 3 days, the legend of the Reaper would take its next step toward becoming reality. The hunt was about to begin. The arena of Zirian Prime was a monument to the hegemony's love of spectacle and suffering. Built into the heart of a dead volcano, its circular floor stretched nearly half a kilometer across, surrounded by ascending tiers of seats that could hold over 200,000 spectators. The walls rose like cliffs toward a retractable dome that could display the stars or project holographic environments for themed combat events. Marcus stood in the preparation chamber beneath the arena floor, surrounded by other fighters who would compete in the day's events. Some were veterans like himself, beings who had been fighting in the pits for years and bore the scars to prove it. Others were fresh meat, newly captured prisoners whose terror was so thick you could taste it in the recycled air. The preparation chamber was a study in controlled chaos. Weapon racks lined the walls, filled with everything from primitive bladed weapons to advanced energy constructs designed to maim rather than kill quickly. The hegemony wanted their spectacles to last, after all. Quick deaths were poor entertainment. "First time in the big arena?" asked a voice behind him. Marcus turned to see a creature he recognized as Thane, a Corellian whose blue-scaled hide was crisscrossed with ritual scarring. Thane had been a prisoner for over 6 years, long enough to become something of a legend among the other fighters. His survival record was impressive by any standard. "Not my first arena," Marcus replied carefully, "but this is the largest I've seen." Zirian Prime is the premier gladiatorial facility in this sector. They bring in fighters from across the galaxy for the big events. Today is the monthly championship qualifier. Winners advance to face the sector champions. Losers become fertilizer for the arena gardens. Thane gestured toward the viewing screens mounted on the chamber walls, which showed the arena floor being prepared for the day's events. Maintenance crews were installing environmental hazards, energy barriers, and weapon caches at strategic locations across the fighting surface. "What kind of challenges?" Marcus asked, though he kept his tone casual. Information was valuable here, and showing too much interest could mark him as either desperate or dangerous. "Varies. Sometimes it's straight combat, fighter versus fighter until one can't continue. Sometimes they add beasts from various worlds, creatures bred specifically for aggression and pain tolerance. Sometimes they create scenarios like siege warfare or survival challenges where multiple fighters compete for limited resources." On the screens, Marcus could see the arena floor transforming. Sections of the ground were rising and falling, creating an artificial landscape of hills, valleys, and structures. Weapon caches were being placed at specific intervals, their contents hidden behind energy fields that would only deactivate once combat began. "The betting pools are interesting today," Thane continued, his scaled features showing what might have been amusement. "Word has spread about a new fighter, someone the guards are calling unusual. Odds are heavily against this mystery fighter surviving the first round." Marcus said nothing, but he suspected he knew who the mystery fighter was. The guards had been talking about him in hushed tones since his arrival, comparing him to some legend they called the Reaper. Apparently, the similarity was enough to make them nervous. A chime sounded through the chamber, and a holographic announcer appeared in the center of the room. The figure was a perfect example of hegemony propaganda aesthetics, designed to appear noble and inspiring while delivering news of impending death. "Greetings, competitors. Today's championship qualifier will consist of 3 phases. Phase 1 is survival selection. 20 fighters will enter the arena simultaneously. The last 8 standing will advance to Phase 2. Phase 3 will determine the quarterly champion, who will earn the right to challenge the sector champion next month." The hologram gestured, and individual fighter profiles appeared floating in the air around the chamber. Marcus saw his own image among them, listed simply as Subject 7749, species unknown, combat rating estimated high. No mention of his name or origin, just another piece of meat to be fed to the arena. Phase 1 begins in 30 minutes. Fighters, select your initial equipment and prepare for deployment. The other fighters moved toward the weapon racks with various levels of urgency. The veterans like Thane took their time, selecting familiar weapons they'd used before. The newcomers grabbed whatever looked most impressive, not understanding that in arena combat, familiarity was worth more than raw power. Marcus approached the racks methodically. He'd spent his 3 years of captivity studying every weapon and fighting style he'd encountered. The guards thought they were breaking him with endless transfers and brutal conditions, but they'd actually been giving him the finest combat education available. Every facility had different weapons, different fighting techniques, different ways to kill or be killed. He selected a standard plasma knife, its blade capable of cutting through most armor and cauterizing wounds to extend combat time. For backup, he chose a particle whip, a weapon that required skill to use effectively, but could disable opponents from a distance. Finally, he picked up a small shield generator, the kind that could deflect energy attacks, but would burn out quickly under sustained fire. The key to arena survival wasn't having the best weapons. It was understanding the psychology of the spectacle. The crowds wanted to see drama, heroism, betrayal, and ultimately, the triumph of their favored champion. A fighter who could read the crowd and give them what they wanted could survive situations that would kill someone who relied purely on combat skills. As he strapped on his equipment, Marcus thought about the message he'd found in his cell. The Reaper comes. Someone had been building a legend, preparing the ground for something bigger than simple arena combat. The question was whether that someone was still alive, and whether Marcus could find them before the hegemony decided he was too dangerous to keep around. The final preparation chime sounded, and the fighters were herded toward the deployment platforms. These were essentially giant elevators that would raise them into the arena floor at different locations, giving each fighter a brief moment to survey the battlefield before combat began. Marcus found himself assigned to Platform 7, positioned near what the tactical display showed as a cluster of rocky outcroppings on the arena's eastern edge. Good defensive terrain, but it would put him far from the central weapon caches where the most desperate fighting would occur. As his platform began to rise, Marcus could hear the roar of the crowd above. 200,000 beings from across the galaxy, all gathered to watch sentient creatures destroy each other for entertainment. The sound was like ocean waves breaking against stone, rhythmic and inevitable. The arena floor materialized around him as his platform locked into place. The artificial environment was stunning in its complexity. Rocky hills and valleys stretched across the fighting surface, dotted with ancient-looking ruins that housed weapon caches and defensive positions. Streams of luminescent liquid flowed between the terrain features, beautiful but almost certainly lethal to touch. Around the arena's perimeter, Marcus could see the other 19 fighters emerging from their own platforms. Some immediately sprinted toward the central weapon caches. Others, like him, took a moment to assess the tactical situation. A few seemed paralyzed by the enormity of the arena and the screaming crowd. The starting horns sounded, a deep bass note that reverberated through the arena floor and marked the official beginning of combat. Marcus immediately moved toward higher ground, using the rocky outcroppings to mask his movement while he observed the other fighters' behavior. The first casualties came within minutes. 2 fighters met at a central weapon cache and engaged in close combat while a third picked them off from a distance with a beam rifle. Another fighter triggered some kind of environmental trap and was consumed by a pillar of superheated plasma that erupted from the arena floor. Marcus watched and learned. The veterans were playing a longer game, avoiding the early carnage while the inexperienced fighters eliminated each other. Thane had taken position in a defensive structure on the arena's western side, calmly picking off targets of opportunity while staying out of major engagements. But there was something else happening that the crowd couldn't see from their elevated seats. The fighters weren't just randomly attacking each other. There were patterns, subtle communications, brief alliances forming and dissolving as the combat evolved. This wasn't just a free-for-all. It was organized chaos, with veteran fighters manipulating the newer arrivals into eliminating threats and clearing advantageous positions. Marcus realized he was being watched. A female fighter with distinctly reptilian features had taken position across a small valley from him and was observing his movement patterns. She held a long-range energy weapon, but wasn't firing. Instead, she seemed to be waiting for something. The crowd's roar intensified as 2 fighters engaged in spectacular combat near the arena center. Energy blasts lit up the artificial landscape while the combatants leaped between ruins and dodged environmental hazards. One was clearly more skilled, but the other was putting on a better show, spinning and diving in ways that looked impressive but were tactically questionable. It was theater. The skilled fighter was allowing the combat to continue longer than necessary, giving the crowd what they wanted while positioning for a dramatic finishing move. Marcus filed that observation away for future use. By the time the combat had reduced the field to 12 fighters, Marcus still hadn't fired a shot. He'd moved twice to avoid being trapped by terrain changes, and once to collect equipment from a fallen fighter, but he'd managed to avoid direct confrontation. The reptilian female was still watching him, and he was becoming convinced she was waiting for something specific. The arena's environmental systems activated a new challenge. Sections of the floor began rotating, changing the tactical landscape, and forcing fighters out of established positions. Marcus found himself exposed on open ground just as 3 other fighters converged on his position. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. 3 years of captivity, of being treated like property, of watching his fellow humans disappear into the hegemony's machinery of oppression. 3 years of planning and preparing for the chance to remind the galaxy what humans were capable of when pushed too far. The first attacker came at him with a vibroblade, the kind of weapon that could slice through armor like paper. Marcus stepped into the attack instead of away from it, inside the weapon's arc, and drove his plasma knife upward in a movement too fast for most beings to track. The blade found the gap between his attacker's armor plates, and the fight was over in seconds. The crowd's roar changed pitch, becoming more focused, more intense. They'd seen something they didn't expect. The second attacker was more cautious, using a particle beam to keep Marcus at distance. But Marcus had fought beings with energy weapons before. He used the terrain, bouncing between rocks, and ruins and patterns that confused targeting systems. When he finally closed the distance, his movements were economical, precise, lethal. The particle whip wrapped around his opponent's weapon arm, and a single activation pulse disabled both the weapon and the being holding it. The third attacker stopped advancing. Something in Marcus's movements, in the way he dispatched the other 2 fighters, had triggered recognition. This was a veteran, someone who'd survived long enough to develop instincts about dangerous opponents. "You're not what you appear to be," the third fighter said, speaking in Galactic Standard. It was a Veltar, similar to Cax from the transport ship, but older and more scarred. "None of us are," Marcus replied. The Veltar nodded slowly, then deliberately lowered his weapon. "I've heard stories, whispers in the depths of the facilities. They say there's a new legend being born in the arenas. They call it the Reaper." Marcus felt his heart rate increase, though his external expression remained calm. "What kind of stories?" "A fighter who doesn't just win. A fighter who breaks the rules without breaking them, who inspires others to remember what they've lost. They say this fighter is building something. A network. A resistance." The arena's crowd was growing restless. 2 fighters standing close together without combat was not the entertainment they'd paid to see. The announcers were building drama, speculating about negotiations or psychological warfare, but Marcus could feel the pressure building. "Is that what you are?" the Veltar asked. "Are you the Reaper?" Marcus considered his answer carefully. To claim the title would make him a target for both the hegemony authorities and any fighter looking to build reputation by defeating a legend. To deny it might lose him an opportunity to connect with whatever network was being built. "I'm someone who remembers what freedom feels like," he said finally. The Veltar smiled, showing predator teeth. "Good enough." He raised his voice so the arena's audio systems would pick it up. "I yield to the superior fighter." The crowd exploded in confusion and anger. Yielding was technically allowed under arena rules, but it was considered cowardly and unsportsmanlike. The Veltar would face punishment after the event, possibly even termination. But he'd also just made a statement that every prisoner in the facility would hear and remember. Marcus advanced to the final 8 without having to kill anyone who might have been useful to a growing resistance. As he was escorted back to the preparation chamber for Phase 2, he caught sight of the reptilian female who'd been watching him. She was among the survivors, and when their eyes met, she nodded once. The second phase will be different. Smaller groups, more personal combat, less room for subtlety. But Marcus was no longer thinking just about survival. He was thinking about the message scratched into his cell wall, about the whispers among the prisoners, about the way the guards seemed nervous when certain names were mentioned. The legend of the Reaper was real, and it was growing. The question now was whether Marcus could become part of it, or whether he was destined to become its next chapter. Either way, The hegemony was about to learn that some things couldn't be contained, no matter how strong the chains. The second phase preparation chamber was smaller than the first, designed for the elite fighters who had survived the initial culling. Only 8 beings remained from the original 20, and the atmosphere was markedly different. Gone was the nervous energy and desperate bravado of the newcomers. What remained was the cold calculation of survivors who had learned to treat violence as a profession. Marcus studied his fellow competitors as they prepared for the next challenge. Thane had made it through, as expected, his blue scales showing several new scars, but no serious injuries. The reptilian female who'd been watching him was there as well, methodically checking her equipment with the precision of a trained soldier. 2 other beings he didn't recognize, both showing the hardened demeanor of arena veterans. But it was the 8th fighter that captured his attention. Massive even by galactic standards, covered in what looked like natural armor plating, with 4 arms that ended in claws capable of rending steel. Marcus had never seen its species before, but the way the other fighters gave it a wide berth suggested it had earned their respect through bloody demonstration. Phase 2 will be quite different from your survival trial. Announced a new holographic figure, this one bearing the insignia of an arena master. 4 teams of 2 fighters each will face challenges designed to test not just combat ability, but tactical thinking, resource management, and teamwork. Teams will be assigned randomly. Marcus felt a chill of apprehension. Random team assignments meant he could end up paired with anyone, including someone who might try to eliminate him as soon as they were alone. The arena masters were clever in their cruelty, always finding new ways to add psychological pressure to the physical challenges. The hologram gestured, and team assignments appeared floating in the air. Marcus found himself paired with the reptilian female, while Thane was matched with one of the unknowns. The massive armored creature was paired with what appeared to be a juvenile member of some insectoid species, creating an obviously unbalanced team that would provide entertainment through its very mismatch. Teams will have 10 minutes to strategize before deployment. Phase 2 begins with 4 simultaneous challenges in separate arena sections. The 2 teams that complete their objectives fastest will advance to the final phase. Failure to complete objectives within the time limit will result in immediate termination of both team members. As the other teams spread out to plan their strategies, Marcus approached his assigned partner. Up close, he could see that her reptilian features were more refined than he'd initially observed. Her scales had an iridescent quality that suggested she might be from one of the core worlds, and her equipment was of higher quality than most arena fighters possessed. "I am Vexalia," she said, her voice carrying the clipped precision of military training. "Former commander of the 3rd Expeditionary Force of the Kethmoran Republic. And you're not what your file suggests. Marcus, former soldier, among other things. You've been watching me since the first phase." "What?" Her large, golden eyes studied him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Because you move like someone who has been trained by masters, not like a random prisoner pulled from a transport. Your combat technique shows influences from at least 3 different fighting disciplines, all adapted for zero gravity and urban warfare. Most arena fighters are brutes or desperate survivors. You're something else entirely." Marcus considered how much to reveal. Vexalia was clearly intelligent and experienced, but that didn't necessarily make her trustworthy. In the arena system, alliances were temporary at best. "We should focus on the challenge," he said diplomatically. "What do you know about Phase 2 objectives?" She nodded, accepting his deflection for the moment. "I have participated in 4 Phase 2 challenges. The scenarios typically involve one of 3 categories: combat trials against enhanced opponents, puzzle challenges that require both fighters to survive, or resource-gathering missions in hostile environments. All are designed to eliminate teams through attrition rather than direct combat." The preparation timer showed 5 minutes remaining. Around them, the other teams were engaged in heated strategy discussions, trying to anticipate what they might face and how best to work together despite being strangers forced in a partnership. "There is something else," Vexalia said quietly, moving closer so their conversation couldn't be overheard. The guards have been talking. They're nervous about something, more nervous than I have seen them in all my time here. They speak of transfer orders from Sector Command, additional security protocols, and someone called the Reaper. Marcus kept his expression neutral. What about this Reaper? Stories. Legends. A fighter who appeared several months ago in the Outer Rim facilities and began winning matches in ways that defied explanation. Not just skill combat, but something else. The ability to inspire other fighters to create coordination among prisoners who had never met before. Some say this Reaper is building a network, preparing for something larger than arena combat. And what do you believe? Vexalia's smile revealed rows of sharp teeth. I believe that legends are often based on truth, and that the hegemony's nervousness suggests this truth is something they fear. I also believe that today's randomly assigned teams were not as random as they claimed. Before Marcus could respond, the deployment chime sounded. The teams were directed to separate transport platforms that would take them to their designated challenge areas. As Marcus and Vexalia boarded their assigned platform, he caught a glimpse of the arena's main display screens showing 4 different environments being prepared simultaneously. Their platform descended through the arena infrastructure into a completely separate chamber, one that had been configured to resemble an industrial complex. Massive machines hummed with energy, casting strange shadows through the artificial atmosphere. The air tasted of ozone and recycled hydrocarbons. Objective parameters downloading announced the arena system. A holographic display materialized in front of them, showing a schematic of the complex and highlighting specific locations. Team 7 must retrieve 4 power cores from secured locations and deliver them to the central processing station. Warning: complex is defended by automated security systems and environmental hazards. Time limit: 1 standard hour. The industrial complex stretched for several kilometers in each direction, a maze of corridors, machinery, and multi-level platforms connected by maintenance walkways. The power core locations were marked on their tactical display, each one requiring them to penetrate deeper into the facility's most dangerous areas. Classic resource gathering mission, Vexalia observed, studying the layout. The security systems will become more aggressive as we progress, and the environmental hazards will be designed to separate us or force us into tactical errors. Marcus nodded, but he was thinking about something else. The complexity of the facility, the sophistication of its defenses, the way it seemed almost too real to be just an arena challenge. This isn't just a training facility, he realized. This is based on an actual hegemony installation. You are correct. Vexalia's voice carried a note of approval. The arena masters often use real facility layouts for their challenges. It allows them to test potential security weaknesses while providing entertainment. This particular layout appears to be based on a Class 7 industrial station. You recognize it? I may have visited a similar facility during my military service, before I became property of the hegemony. Her expression darkened. Knowledge that may be useful if we encounter situations not covered in the tactical briefing. The starting signal activated, and they began moving into the complex. The first power core was located in a maintenance section that required them to navigate through active machinery. Massive pistons and rotating assemblies created a constantly changing obstacle course, while automated scanners swept the area looking for unauthorized personnel. Marcus took point, using his smaller frame to slip through gaps that would challenge someone of Vexalia's size. But she proved equally capable, her military training evident in the way she moved through hostile terrain. They reached the first power core without triggering any alarms, working together to extract it from its security housing. Efficient teamwork, she observed as they began moving toward the second location. You adapt quickly to unfamiliar partners. I've had practice working with different species, Marcus replied. It was true, though he didn't mention that most of that practice had come from working with alien resistance fighters during the evacuation of Earth. The hegemony had been thorough, but they hadn't been unopposed. The second power core location was more challenging, requiring them to cross an area filled with energy barriers and automated defense turrets. The barriers moved in predictable patterns, but the timing was tight, and a single mistake would trigger the turrets. Marcus watched the pattern for several cycles, noting the brief windows when multiple barriers would be down simultaneously. "There," he said, pointing to a path that would require precise timing and perfect coordination. "We go together exactly 10 seconds after the next barrier cycle begins." They made the crossing flawlessly, their movements synchronized despite having worked together for less than an hour. Vex'ahlia retrieved the second power core, while Marcus kept watch for patrol drones. "You have done this before," she said as they prepared to move to the third location. "Not this specific challenge, but this kind of operation. Infiltration, resource extraction, working with temporary allies in hostile territory." Marcus met her gaze steadily. "Haven't we all? Isn't that what survival in the arena system requires?" "No. Most fighters learn to survive through individual prowess. You think like someone who has commanded operations, who has been responsible for the survival of others. Your tactical awareness, your leadership instincts, your ability to read terrain and predict enemy responses. These are not skills you learn in captivity." The third power core location required them to descend several levels through increasingly dangerous territory. The facility's automated systems were adapting to their presence, making each challenge more difficult than the last. But Marcus found himself thinking less about the immediate obstacles and more about Vex'ahlia's observations. She was right, of course. His training and experience went far beyond what any ordinary soldier would possess. During the final days on Earth, when it became clear that evacuation was the only option, he'd been part of the special operations teams responsible for getting civilian populations to the transport ships. He'd learned to work with alien allies, to adapt human tactics to non-human capabilities, to think several steps ahead of enemy responses. But, more than that, he learned to inspire hope in hopeless situations. To make people believe they could survive when every rational assessment said they were doomed. The resistance networks that had formed during Earth's final days had been built on that foundation. The stubborn human refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed inevitable. The third power core was heavily defended, surrounded by an energy field that required both fighters to disable simultaneously from separate control stations. As they prepared for the coordinated attack, Vex'ahlia spoke quietly. "There is something I must tell you. My assignment to your team was not random. I requested it specifically." Marcus paused in his preparations. "Why?" "Because I have been watching more than your combat techniques. I have been observing your effect on other fighters, other prisoners. There is something about you that makes others remember things they had forgotten. Hope, dignity, the belief that their situation is not permanent." She gestured around them at the industrial complex. This facility, these challenges, the entire arena system exists to break spirits as much as bodies. To convince entire species that resistance is futile, that the hegemony's dominance is natural and inevitable. But you make people remember that it is not. "And what do you want from me?" Vex'ahlia's smile was sharp and predatory. "I want to know if you're the one they call the Reaper. And if you are, I want to offer you something that might interest you." Before Marcus could respond, she activated her control station. "Now!" They disabled the energy field simultaneously, and Marcus grabbed the third power core. But as they prepared to move toward the final location, the facility's security systems activated a new protocol. Emergency lights began flashing, and blast doors started sealing throughout the complex. "Final core location is now under lockdown," announced the arena system. "Team 7 has 30 minutes to breach security and retrieve objective before facility enters emergency sterilization mode." Marcus looked at Vex'ahlia. "Emergency sterilization mode? Everything in the facility gets incinerated. It is how these installations prevent classified information from falling into enemy hands during hostile capture operations." They had 30 minutes to penetrate the most heavily defended area of the facility retrieve the final power core, and reach the extraction point. It was a challenge designed to push even veteran teams to their absolute limits. But as they began moving through the increasingly hostile environment, Marcus realized that something had changed in their dynamic. Vexalia had revealed more than she intended with her comments about requests and offers. She knew more about the situation than she'd initially let on, which meant that whatever was happening here, whatever legend was building around the name Reaper, it was bigger than just arena combat. And apparently, he was at the center of it whether he wanted to be or not. The final power core was housed in a vault deep within the facility's most secure section, protected by layers of security that would have challenged a military assault team. With only 30 minutes before emergency sterilization, Marcus and Vexalia moved through corridors that had become killing fields of automated defenses and environmental hazards. "Talk while we move," Marcus said, ducking under a sweep of energy beams that tracked their movement through the corridor. "What offer were you talking about?" Vexalia leaped over a pressure plate that would have triggered explosive charges, landing silently on the far side. "There is a network. Prisoners throughout this sector who have begun coordinating their efforts, sharing information, preparing for something larger than individual survival." They reached a junction where blast doors had sealed off the direct route to the vault. Marcus studied the facility schematics on their tactical display, looking for alternate paths. The maintenance tunnels were still open, but they were filled with automated repair drones that had been reprogrammed for security duty. Maintenance route, he decided. We'll have to deal with the drones, but it's the only way to reach the vault before the sterilization protocol activates. As they entered the maintenance tunnel system, Vexalia continued her explanation. The network began forming several months ago, when stories started spreading about a fighter who was different from the others. Someone who won matches not just through superior combat ability, but through tactical innovation and psychological warfare. The first repair drone detected their presence and transformed from a simple maintenance unit into a multi-armed combat platform. Marcus disabled it with a focused burst from his particle whip, while Vexalia provided covering fire against a second drone that emerged from an alcove. This fighter began leaving messages, she said, jumping over the wreckage of the disabled drones. Hidden communications that spread through the prisoner population. Instructions for creating weapons from common materials. Techniques for exploiting weaknesses in facility security. Most importantly, reminders that their situation was temporary. They encountered heavier resistance as they moved deeper into the tunnel system. Groups of drones working in coordination, energy barriers that required both fighters to disable simultaneously, and environmental hazards that forced them to trust each other completely. The guards noticed the change in prisoner behavior, Vexalia explained as they disabled another security barrier. Less despair, more coordination, subtle acts of defiance that couldn't be punished without punishing entire prisoner populations. They began investigating, trying to identify the source of the changes. Marcus felt pieces clicking into place in his mind, and they traced it back to the fighter you're talking about. They traced it back to the Reaper, a title that was being whispered in facility after facility, always associated with impossible victories and growing resistance networks. But when they tried to locate this Reaper, they discovered something that terrified them. They reached the vault level just as the 20-minute warning sounded. The final power core was behind energy shields that would require careful coordination to defeat, and the sterilization countdown was proceeding regardless of whether they completed their mission. What did they discover? Vexalia began working on one of the security panels while Marcus handled the other. That there was no single fighter called the Reaper. The name was being used by multiple individuals across multiple facilities. Someone had created a legend that could be adopted by anyone brave enough to carry it forward. The security panels were more complex than anything they'd faced so far, requiring technical knowledge that went beyond typical arena fighter training. But Marcus found himself recognizing patterns in the interface design, similarities to systems he'd encountered during his military service. These are modified hegemony military interfaces, he realized. This facility isn't just based on a real installation. It is a real installation, modified for arena use. Correct. This is a decommissioned Class 7 industrial station that was converted for arena combat after the hegemony conquered the system where it was located. The original security systems are still active beneath the entertainment modifications. Marcus paused in his work on the security panel. You knew this before we started. You've been here before. Vexalia's scaled features showed what might have been embarrassment. I was part of the original assault team that captured this facility during the Kethmoran War. I know its weaknesses because I helped exploit them. The 10-minute warning sounded. Around them, the facility's emergency lighting began flashing more urgently as automated systems prepared for sterilization. But Marcus had stopped working on his security panel entirely. Who are you really? And what kind of offer requires this much setup? Vexalia finished her work and turned to face him directly. I am Commander Vexalia Kethmore, former intelligence officer of the Kethmoran Republic and current coordinator of the Zirian Prime Resistance Cell. And the offer is this: the chance to become what the legend says you already are. Marcus felt the weight of her words settling over him. The network isn't just prisoners sharing survival tips. You're organizing an actual resistance movement. We are. Across 7 prison facilities in this sector, we have established communication protocols and resource-sharing networks. Prisoners who were meant to be broken and discarded are instead becoming the foundation for something the hegemony never anticipated. The 5-minute warning sounded. They had to complete the security override and reach the extraction point, but Marcus found himself paralyzed by the implications of what she was telling him. Why me? There have to be other fighters more qualified to lead a resistance movement. Vexalia's expression became fierce. Because of what you represent. During my intelligence service, I studied every species the hegemony encountered. Most capitulated quickly once their military forces were defeated. Others fought longer, but eventually accepted the reality of hegemony dominance. But there was one species that was different. She began working on Marcus's security panel as she continued talking. One species that had to be completely annihilated because they refused to accept defeat under any circumstances. A species so dangerous to the hegemony's philosophy of inevitable dominance that every trace of their existence had to be erased from official records. Marcus felt his blood turning cold. What species? Humans. The hegemony didn't just conquer your people. They destroyed them utterly because humans represented something that threatened the foundation of everything they believed. Your species proved that any being, no matter how outmatched, could choose to fight rather than surrender. The security vault opened just as the 2-minute warning began. Inside, the final power core waited in a containment field that was already beginning to destabilize as the sterilization protocol prepared to incinerate everything in the facility. You want me to be human, Marcus said, grabbing the power core as Vexalia guided them toward the emergency extraction route. I want you to be what you have always been. What your species was before the hegemony tried to erase it from history. The living proof that their dominance is not inevitable, that resistance is always possible, that some things cannot be conquered. They ran through corridors that were already beginning to heat up as the sterilization systems activated. Energy conduits in the walls were overloading, creating cascading failures throughout the facility. In 90 seconds, everything in the complex would be reduced to plasma. The network already exists, Vexalia shouted over the sound of alarms and failing systems. Resistance cells in dozens of facilities, coordination protocols that allow information and resources to flow between star systems. All it needs is a symbol that can unite the different species under a single banner. They reached the extraction point just as the 60-second warning began. The transport platform was rising, ready to carry them back to the arena preparation areas. But Marcus hesitated at the threshold, looking back at the facility that was about to be destroyed. A symbol like the Reaper, he said. The Reaper was always meant to be more than a single individual. It is an idea that can spread from facility to facility, carried by anyone brave enough to claim it. But ideas need focal points, examples that others can follow. The platform completed its ascent, bringing them back into the arena infrastructure just as the industrial facility below was consumed by controlled plasma detonation. They had completed their mission with seconds to spare, but Marcus barely noticed their success. Instead, he was thinking about the message scratched into his cell wall. Remember Terra. Remember home. The Reaper comes. It hadn't been a prophecy. It had been an invitation. What would you need from me? He asked as they were escorted back to the preparation chamber. Be yourself. Be human. Show the galaxy what your species was before the hegemony tried to erase it. And when you are ready, help us show them what we can all become when we refuse to accept chains. The preparation chamber was nearly empty now. Only 4 fighters remained, which meant the other 2 teams had failed to complete their objectives in time. Marcus and Vexalia had advanced to the final phase, along with Thane and his partner. But Marcus was no longer thinking about arena combat. He was thinking about the legend that had been building around the name Reaper, about the network of resistance that was spreading through the hegemony's prison systems, about the opportunity to transform from a captive into something the hegemony had thought they destroyed forever. He was thinking about becoming human again, not just for himself, but for every being who had been told that resistance was futile and freedom was impossible. The final phase would begin soon, but the real challenge had already started. The question was no longer whether he would survive the arena. The question was whether he was ready to become the symbol that might help an entire galaxy remember that some chains were meant to be broken. Vexalia watched him with golden eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. You are considering it. I'm considering whether I'm the right person for what you're proposing. There is no right person. There are only those who choose to act when action is required. She paused, then added quietly, your people understood that better than any species the hegemony ever encountered. Perhaps it is time the galaxy was reminded why they found humans so dangerous. The final phase preparation began around them, but Marcus was already preparing for something much larger than arena combat. The legend of the Reaper was about to take on new meaning, and the hegemony was about to discover that some species refused to stay dead, no matter how thoroughly they were buried. The final phase arena was unlike anything Marcus had seen before. Instead of a single large space, it consisted of multiple interconnected chambers, each designed to test different aspects of combat ability and tactical thinking. The 4 remaining fighters would face each other in a series of escalating challenges, with the ultimate victor earning the right to challenge the sector champion. But as Marcus stood with Vexalia in the final preparation chamber, he realized that the real challenge had already begun. Across the room, Thane and his partner were engaged in quiet conversation, but Marcus could see the tension in their body language. Something had changed during their Phase 2 mission, something that had altered the dynamic between them. Complications, Vexalia observed, following his gaze. Thane's partner is a hegemony loyalist. Former military, volunteered for gladiator service to earn citizenship rights for his family. He discovered Thane's involvement with the resistance network during their mission. Marcus felt the familiar weight of tactical decisions settling over him. In the arena, information was survival, and loyalty could shift in an instant depending on what fighters thought would keep them alive longest. Will he report it? Unknown. But Thane's usefulness to the network is compromised regardless. We may need to consider him a security risk. The cold calculation in her voice reminded Marcus that Vexalia had been a military intelligence officer before becoming a prisoner. She was thinking like a commander, weighing the value of individual assets against the larger mission objectives. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had kept the resistance network operational across multiple facilities. Final phase parameters downloading, announced the arena system. Holographic displays materialized around the chamber, showing the complex multi-chamber layout they would be fighting in. 4 fighters will enter simultaneously at different locations. The challenge will consist of 3 stages: individual survival, tactical cooperation, and final confrontation. Elimination rules apply throughout all stages. Marcus studied the arena layout carefully. The individual survival stage would test each fighter's ability to navigate hostile environments alone. The tactical cooperation stage would force temporary alliances between fighters who had been trying to eliminate each other. The final confrontation would determine the ultimate victor through direct combat. It was a sophisticated psychological test as much as a physical challenge. The arena masters wanted to see how fighters adapted to changing circumstances, how they formed and broke alliances under pressure, and ultimately who possessed the combination of skills and ruthlessness necessary to become a champion. "There is something else you should know," Vexalia said quietly, checking her weapon systems one final time. "The Resistance Network has been monitoring communications between hegemony facilities. There are indications that Sector Command has become aware of organized resistance activities." Marcus felt a chill of apprehension. How aware? Aware enough to order increased security protocols and the transfer of certain high-value prisoners to maximum security facilities. The window for large-scale action may be closing. She gestured toward the arena displays, where technical specifications for the final phase were scrolling past. "This may be our last opportunity to create the kind of public demonstration that could inspire broader resistance activities." Marcus understood what she was really saying. The arena broadcasts reached across the sector, carrying images of combat to billions of viewers. A sufficiently dramatic victory, accompanied by the right kind of message, could transform local resistance networks into something approaching a galactic movement. And if I'm not ready for that kind of responsibility? Vexalia's golden eyes fixed on him with unwavering intensity. "Then billions of beings will continue to live as property of the hegemony, and your species will remain nothing but a cautionary tale told to keep rebellious populations in line." The deployment chime sounded before Marcus could respond. The four fighters were directed to separate entrance platforms that would place them at different points in the arena complex. As Marcus took his position, he could see Thane being escorted to a platform on the far side of the preparation area. Their eyes met briefly, and Thane gave him an almost imperceptible nod. Whatever complications existed with his partner, Thane was still part of the network. The question was whether that connection would survive the pressures of the final phase. Marcus's platform began to descend, carrying him into the arena complex through what appeared to be a military-grade airlock system. The chamber he emerged into was configured as an urban warfare environment, complete with multi-story buildings, rubble-strewn streets, and environmental hazards designed to simulate combat in a war zone. Individual survival stage initiated announced the arena system. Fighters must navigate to designated extraction points while avoiding automated defense systems and environmental hazards. Time limit, 45 minutes. Failure to reach extraction point results in immediate termination. The urban environment stretched for several kilometers in each direction, a maze of damaged structures and defensive positions. Marcus could see his extraction point marked on his tactical display, located in what appeared to be a fortified compound at the far end of the combat zone. But as he began moving through the simulated city, he realized that the environment was more than just an arena challenge. The building layouts, the defensive positions, the placement of automated weapons systems all followed patterns he recognized from his military training. This wasn't just an urban warfare simulation. It was a recreation of specific battles from real conflicts. The first automated defense system he encountered was a cluster of surveillance drones that began tracking his movement through the streets. Standard counter-surveillance techniques allowed him to avoid their detection, but the experience triggered memories of similar situations during the evacuation of Earth. Moving through the damaged cityscape, Marcus found himself thinking about the last days of his homeworld. The desperate fighting in urban centers, while civilian populations fled to evacuation points. The way human military forces had adapted their tactics to work alongside alien allies who thought differently about combat and survival. He'd been part of joint operations with Kethmoran forces during the evacuation. Commander Vexalia might not remember him specifically, but he'd worked with her people before. The recognition was mutual, which explained why she'd been watching him so carefully. The extraction point was heavily defended by automated weapons systems that would require careful planning to defeat. But as Marcus studied the defensive layout, he realized that the arena masters had made a mistake in their recreation of historical battles. They'd used the original Kethmoran defensive positions without accounting for the tactical innovations that had ultimately allowed the evacuation forces to break through. Marcus spent precious minutes working his way around to an approach vector that should have been impossible to access. But if his memory of the original battle was accurate, there would be a maintenance tunnel system that could bypass the main defensive lines. The tunnel entrance was exactly where he remembered it, concealed beneath debris from a collapsed building. The maintenance system was still active, its automated repair drones continuing their programmed functions despite the simulated battle raging above. Moving through the tunnels, Marcus began to understand what Vexalia had meant about becoming a symbol. The arena wasn't just entertainment. It was education, designed to teach viewers that resistance was futile by showing them recreations of historical defeats. Every battle environment, every challenge scenario was based on actual conflicts where the hegemony had emerged victorious. But the arena masters had made the same mistake that military historians often made. They assumed that victory was inevitable, that the only factors worth studying were the ones that led to their preferred outcome. They'd recreated the battles without understanding what had made their enemies dangerous in the first place. Marcus emerged from the tunnel system inside the fortified compound, bypassing all the defensive systems that should have prevented his approach. His extraction point was a simple beacon in the center of the compound, but reaching it would require crossing an open area covered by multiple weapon systems. Instead of attempting to fight through the defenses, Marcus used techniques he'd learned during the evacuation: misdirection, timing, and the principle that the most direct path was usually the most heavily defended. He created distractions at multiple points around the compound, drew the automated systems out of position, and reached his extraction point with 12 minutes to spare. Individual survival stage complete, announced the arena system. Tactical cooperation stage will begin in 10 minutes. Fighters will be assigned temporary partnership objectives that must be completed through coordinated effort. As Marcus waited in the extraction chamber, he thought about the choice Vexalia had presented to him. The resistance network was real, and it was growing, but it needed something to transform it from a collection of local cells into a unified movement. The legend of the Reaper could provide that unification, but only if someone was willing to step forward and claim the responsibility that came with it. The tactical cooperation stage began with Marcus being paired with Thane's partner, the hegemony loyalist whose discovery of resistance activities had created complications. They were assigned an objective that required them to work together to disable a series of defensive installations while under fire from mobile attack platforms. The loyalist, who identified himself as Sergeant Karath of the Hegemony Colonial Defense Force, was professionally competent but clearly conflicted about his situation. He worked effectively with Marcus to complete their objectives, but his body language suggested he was struggling with divided loyalties. "You're the one they call the Reaper," Karath said during a brief lull in the combat. It wasn't a question. "I'm someone who remembers what freedom felt like," Marcus replied, using the same words he'd spoken to the Veltar fighter during the first phase. "My family serves the hegemony faithfully. My children attend hegemony schools. My spouse works in hegemony administration. My service in the arena earns them citizenship rights and social advancement opportunities they could never achieve otherwise." Marcus nodded, understanding the impossible position Karath found himself in. "And what does your service cost them?" "It costs them a father and husband who sells violence for the entertainment of beings who view him as property. But it provides them security and opportunity." They completed their tactical cooperation objectives and advanced to the final confrontation stage. The arena environment reconfigured itself into a simple combat space, circular and unadorned, designed to showcase pure fighting ability without environmental complications. For fighters had entered the final phase. Two would emerge. Marcus and Karath had worked effectively together, but they both understood that cooperation was ending. Vexalia and Thane had survived their tactical cooperation challenge as well, which meant the final confrontation would pit former allies against each other. The arena's crowd was reaching levels of excitement that Marcus could feel as vibrations through the facility structure. 200,000 beings from across the galaxy were watching, waiting to see which fighter would emerge as the sector champion challenger. But Marcus was thinking about something larger than personal victory. He was thinking about the message that could be sent, the symbol that could be created, and the choice between survival and significance. The final confrontation began with no announcement, no ceremony. For fighters in a circle, weapons ready, with the understanding that only the strongest would survive. Karath moved first, attacking Thane with the disciplined precision of hegemony military training. Vexalia circled toward Marcus, her reptilian features showing anticipation rather than aggression. She understood what was at stake here, understood that the real battle was not between the fighters in the arena, but between the ideas they represented. Marcus made his choice. Instead of engaging in combat, he stepped to the center of the arena and spoke in a voice that carried across the circular space. "My name is Marcus Chun. I am human, and I am the Reaper." The arena fell silent. The crowd's roar diminished to confused murmur as they tried to process what they'd heard. Humans were myths, legends told to frighten rebellious populations. They didn't exist in the flesh, certainly not in the arena. 3 years ago, the hegemony destroyed my world and scattered my people across the galaxy as slaves and property. They did this because they feared what we represented. The idea that any being, regardless of species or circumstance, could choose freedom over submission. Vexalia had stopped moving, her weapon lowered. Even Karath had paused in his attack on Thane, all 4 fighters frozen by the implications of Marcus's declaration. The hegemony wants you to believe that their dominance is natural and inevitable, that resistance is futile, that survival requires submission, that freedom is a luxury for the strong. Marcus's voice carried throughout the arena, amplified by systems designed to broadcast every word to viewers across the sector. But I stand here as proof that they are wrong. I stand here as a human, a member of a species they tried to erase from history. And I stand here to tell you that the choice between chains and freedom belongs to you, not to your captors. The crowd's murmur was growing louder, confused but intrigued. This was not the entertainment they'd expected, but it was something they'd never seen before. Open defiance in the heart of the hegemony's most prestigious arena. Karath raised his weapon, pointing it at Marcus. "You're asking me to choose between my family's security and your revolution. I'm asking you to choose between a security built on submission and a freedom built on courage. Your family deserves both. Your children deserve to grow up in a galaxy where their value isn't determined by their usefulness to the hegemony." The arena's security systems were activating. Marcus could see energy barriers beginning to deploy around the combat space as facility authorities tried to contain whatever was happening. But the broadcast was live, transmitted to billions of viewers who were hearing words that had been forbidden for 3 years. Karath lowered his weapon. "My children deserve better than what I can give them through service to beings who view us as property." The energy barriers completed their deployment just as hegemony security forces began entering the arena. But it was too late. The message had been broadcast, the symbol had been created, and the legend of the Reaper had transformed from whispered hope into public declaration. The final confrontation was ending, but a larger battle was just beginning. Across the galaxy, in facility after facility, prisoners who had been told that resistance was futile were hearing that a human stood in the heart of the hegemony's greatest arena, and declared that freedom was a choice available to all. The chains were beginning to break, and this time they would stay broken. Marcus looked at his fellow fighters, at the security forces surrounding them, at the cameras that were still broadcasting their image to billions of viewers. The Reaper had finally emerged from legend into reality. The hunt was over. The war for freedom was about to begin.